I declare, after all, there is no enjoyment like reading. How much sooner one tires of anything than of a book. Jane Austen. Welcome back to Book Break. Some of you may already be aware that 2017 is the bicentenary or 200th year anniversary since Jane Austen's death. But more than 200 years on, and Jane Austen's literature is still having a massive impact on the world around us and has remained ever popular. During her lifetime, she provided us with 6 phenomenal novels and a selection of short stories, which have since been adapted into numerous on-screen adaptations, including adaptations of the originals as well as new stories inspired by Jane Austen's classic tales, as they seem to resonate continuously despite how many years it's been. Because of this, I'm almost certain that whether or not you've read a Jane Austen novel, you've probably come in contact with one of her stories. Despite this, however, I know that a lot of us have still yet to get into Jane Austen. It took me quite a few years before I read my first Jane Austen novel because I honestly had no idea where I should start. So in today's video, I'm going to talk a little bit about how to get into Jane Austen, different options of places to start, and different adaptations that have been inspired by her original novels. Like I mentioned, Jane Austen wrote 6 novels and a selection of short stories. If you're familiar with nothing else, then I'm sure you've heard the name Pride and Prejudice, the novel starring Elizabeth Bennet and Mr. Darcy. Even if you've already seen 1, 2, 3 adaptations of this book already, even read books inspired by this story, it's always a good place to start because despite being so familiar with the story, there are of course special elements of Jane Austen's original book that add a whole new level to the story. Or in fact, you're wondering what all the fuss about Mr. Darcy is. Pride and Prejudice was in fact the second of Jane Austen's novels to be published, however. Her first novel to be published was Sense and Sensibility, which came out in 1811, 2 years before Pride and Prejudice. This novel follows 2 sisters, Eleanor and Marianne, whose father has passed away, and they and their mother and younger sister are pushed out of their family home as it is inherited by a male relative and have to make do with much smaller, modest circumstances than they are used to. Whilst adapting to these new circumstances, both sisters come in contact with love in different ways. One who commits herself to everything fully, the other who is far more reserved, but both have to figure out what is true and what is false. If you're not already familiar, then Jane Austen's second novel, Pride and Prejudice, follows the Bennet sisters, and in particular Lizzie Bennet, who is the second eldest of her 5 siblings. They too are in danger of being disinherited as they have no brothers. Because of this, their best hopes is to marry into a wealthy family, and their mother is certainly obsessed with finding them the wealthiest of gentlemen. And nobody, it seems, is wealthier than Mr. Fitzwilliam Darcy. But he and Lizzie don't get off to the best of starts. Jane Austen's next novel was Mansfield Park in 1814 and follows Fanny Price, who is taken in by her aunt and uncle as her mother and father don't have the means to take care of all of their children in the way they wish. So Fanny is raised alongside her cousins but is always treated like a second-class citizen in their home. Despite this, her quiet kindness has an effect on many around her. Emma was next in 1815, and this novel follows Emma, a would-be matchmaker who is obsessed with finding everybody in her little town a match, except for herself. She instead is determined never to marry, despite the fact that everybody seems to want to marry her. And Jane Austen's last 2 novels were in fact published after her death, the first one being Persuasion, which was published in 1817. This story follows Anne Elliot, who was pressured by her family to turn down the man she loved as his status was not high enough for them. It's now many years later and she once again comes in contact with Frederick, whose station in life has far improved, but it seems that too much has happened for them to be brought back together. And lastly, for Jane Austen's novels, in 1817 was released Northanger Abbey, which follows Catherine Morland, who's more interested in gothic novels than the real world and is obsessed with having an exciting adventure like the characters in her books. But this obsession with fiction perhaps blinds her to what's really interesting about life. Although it was the last to be published, Northanger Abbey is actually the first novel Jane Austen wrote. So if you're interested in going in that direction and reading Jane Austen's first foray into novel writing, then this may be a good place to start as opposed to leaving it for the last. It's also a nice little short one. The story itself is a bit of a satire on the gothic novel genre. It's also one of Jane Austen's more comedic novels, although she permanently has a good sense of wit throughout her stories. Northanger Abbey Abbey and Emma are certainly two of her most overtly comical novels, so if you're interested in the comedic side of Jane Austen, one of these two might be for you. But if you prefer to dip your toes in with something even shorter, like I mentioned, Jane Austen did write some short stories. This collection, entitled Sanditon, Lady Susan and the History of England, includes those three as well as 11 other shorter works by Jane Austen, so something to dabble your feet in if you're interested. Of course, like I mentioned, there are a wide variety of film and television adaptations of Jane Austen's work, so perhaps if you have a favourite adaptation, that might be a route to starting with her novels. One of my favourite adaptations is the BBC miniseries of Sense and Sensibility. Whatever has engaged you the most in the past on screen may do the same in a novel form, and it's always nice to start with a story you're familiar with. You could also check out the novel that inspired your favourite modern adaptation of Jane Austen. I know a few of you, like me, are probably fans of the film Clueless, which follows Cher, a high school student obsessed with finding love for her friends whilst completely oblivious to the young man who is perhaps falling for her. Sound familiar? Yes, Clueless is in fact inspired by Jane Austen's Emma, so if you're a fan of Clueless, perhaps Emma is a good place to start. Equally, I know many of you will be fans of the film Bridget Jones's Diary, and many of you probably know that it's actually inspired by Pride and Prejudice. Mark Darcy, anyone? It's also an adaptation of a book. So perhaps a gateway into the Jane Austen world would be to dabble your toes in Helen Fielding's original novel and then read the inspiration behind it with Pride and Prejudice. And for those of you who have already read Jane Austen's complete works, perhaps it's time to foray into some modern adaptations. Some of my other favourites which are inspired by Jane Austen include Lost in Austen, which is a 4-part series which melds the modern world and the 1800s as our main character travels back in time, as well as Austenland, which is both a book and a film inspired by the Jane Austen books and follows a young woman who is obsessed with the works of Jane Austen and decides to take a trip to an immersive Jane Austen experience in Britain. But as you can probably tell, Jane Austen has inspired many writers and film producers over the years, so there's quite a few places to go, and if you have any other recommendations then I'd love to hear them in the comments down below. But hopefully this video has given you a little help in finding your starting place with Jane Austen if you're yet to do so, and if you are a Jane Austen fan, I'd love to hear what your favourite novel was or perhaps where you started, and if you think that's a good place to start. If you did enjoy this video, don't forget to give it a thumbs up, subscribe for future Book Break episodes, and I'll see you all again next week.